There's a certain kind of man who doesn't need to say much to make you feel like he's already paying more attention to you than anyone else in the room. I met Stefan at a party I almost didn't go to, on a night that felt completely ordinary, until it didn't. We talked for a while, just talked, and by the time I found out who he actually was, something had already shifted inside me that I couldn't take back. I didn't know then where that night would lead. I just knew I wanted to find out. If stories like this one stay with you, subscribe, give this video a like, and drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. It genuinely means the world, and it's what keeps these stories coming. Now settle in, because this one is worth every minute. I've been to enough of these parties to know exactly how they go. Someone's celebrating something. A promotion, a launch, a birthday that ends in 0. And you show up because you said you would. You make the rounds, you smile at the right moments, and by 10 o'clock, you're calculating how soon you can leave without it being obvious. That was my plan for that Saturday night. I'd been running on empty for weeks. Work had been relentless. I manage accounts for a mid-size marketing firm, which sounds more glamorous than it is. Most days, it means being the person who keeps everything from falling apart, while somehow remaining invisible in the process. I'm good at my job. I'm just not sure my job is good for me anymore. My friend Dana had been pushing me to come out for weeks, saying I needed to stop disappearing into my apartment the second the workday ended. She wasn't wrong. I'd gotten comfortable with quiet in a way that was starting to feel less like peace and more like avoidance. So I went. I wore the black dress I always wear when I can't make a decision, did my makeup properly for the first time in longer than I'd like to admit, and told myself I'd stay for 2 hours. The party was at a rooftop venue downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick and low lighting that makes everyone look better than they probably are. I got there, found Dana, survived the first round of introductions, and then drifted toward the edge of the room the way I always do when the noise gets to be too much. That's when I noticed him. He was near the windows, slightly apart from the group around him, and there was something about the way he held himself that was different from everyone else there. Still, certain, like he had nowhere else to be and no interest in pretending otherwise. He was in a wheelchair, which I registered and then moved past, the way you do when something is simply part of what you're seeing rather than the whole of it. What actually caught my attention was the expression on his face, mildly amused, privately, like he was watching something the rest of the room hadn't noticed yet. I looked away, got a drink, told myself I was not going to spend the night staring at a stranger. And then I turned around, and he was looking directly at me. Not in a way that felt aggressive or odd, just direct, like he'd been waiting to see if I'd look back. I did. And then, because I have never been particularly good at pretending I wasn't just caught doing something, I raised my glass slightly in his direction. He didn't smile, but something in his expression shifted, and for reasons I still can't fully explain, I stayed at that party for another 3 hours. He came to me. That's the part I keep coming back to. I didn't cross the room. I didn't engineer a reason to walk past him. He moved through the crowd, unhurried, and stopped a few feet away from me, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Up close, he was a lot. Dark eyes, strong jaw, the kind of face that looks like it doesn't give much away on purpose. He nodded toward the drink in my hand. "You've been holding that for 20 minutes without finishing it." I looked down at the glass. He wasn't wrong. "I drink slowly when I'm bored," I said. "Are you bored?" I was. I don't know why I said it like that. It just came out. He looked at me for a second, and I had the distinct feeling of being read. Not in an uncomfortable way, more like someone turning a page carefully. He introduced himself as Stefan. Just Stefan. No last name, no title, no context. I told him my name was Jennifer and waited for the usual follow-up questions. "What do you do? How do you know the host? Do you come to these things often?" He didn't ask any of them. Instead, he asked me what I thought about the music, which was some kind of jazz-adjacent playlist that I had been privately annoyed by for the past hour. I told him exactly that. He laughed, a real one, brief and low, and said the host had the same playlist at his last 3 events. We talked. That's the simple version. The longer version is that we stood there for the better part of an hour, and the conversation never once felt like work. He was sharp without being showy about it. He listened in a way that most people don't, actually tracking what I said, responding to the specific thing rather than the general shape of it. At some point, the crowd thinned around us, and I realized I'd stopped monitoring the room entirely, which almost never happens to me at parties. I'd also stopped thinking about leaving. At some point, Dana materialized at my elbow with wide eyes and a look I knew meant she was going to have a lot of questions later. She introduced herself to Stefan, and something changed in the air around us. Subtle, like a frequency shift. Someone nearby said his name, Stefan Calloway. And then the last name landed with the kind of weight that names sometimes carry when you suddenly understand the full sentence. I put it together quickly. The company. The profile I'd seen somewhere online. The kind of name that gets mentioned in rooms I'm usually not in. I looked at him. He was already watching me, with that same expression from across the room earlier, waiting to see what I'd do with the information. "You could have mentioned that," I said. He held my gaze without a flicker. "You didn't ask." And just like that, something between us that had been open and easy closed slightly. Not with hostility, but with the specific tension of 2 people who've just realized they might be playing different games. I didn't hear from him. That was the first thing I noticed in the days that followed. The absence of something I hadn't technically been promised. We hadn't exchanged numbers. The conversation had ended the way it did, with that tension sitting between us like a question neither of us answered. And then Dana had pulled me away for a group photo, and by the time I turned back around, Stefan was on the other side of the room, in conversation with 2 men in suits who had the body language of people who needed something from him. I left 20 minutes later. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that on Sunday, and again on Monday during a conference call I was only half present for, and again on Tuesday when I caught myself typing his name into a search bar and then closing the tab before the results loaded. I'm not sure what that says about me. Probably nothing good. Work filled the week the way it always does, relentlessly and without apology. There was a campaign pitch that needed 3 rounds of revisions, a client who changed his mind about the entire direction on a Thursday afternoon, and a team meeting that could have been an email but wasn't. By Friday, I was tired in that specific way that sleep doesn't entirely fix. Dana called that evening. I knew before I answered that she was going to bring him up. She has a particular kind of patience when she's sitting on information. She waits until she's sure you're ready to crack. "So," she said, "Stefan Calloway." I told her I didn't want to talk about it. She told me that was fine, and then talked about it anyway. Apparently, he was not simply the Stefan Calloway of vague internet recognition. He was, according to Dana, who had done considerably more research than I had, someone whose name appeared regularly in the kind of publications that cover people who shape things, rather than just participate in them. She listed a few details with the enthusiasm of someone reading a highlight reel. I listened without comment. "He asked Marcus for your number," she said near the end. I was quiet for a second. Marcus gave it to him? Marcus said he seemed like someone who doesn't ask for things very often. I didn't respond to that. After I hung up, I sat with it for a while. The idea of Stefan deciding to ask, which felt deliberate in a way that was hard to dismiss. Men like that, from what I understood of them, didn't extend themselves without a reason. My phone buzzed an hour later. Unknown number. The message was short, just 3 lines. He said he'd been thinking about the conversation, that he didn't finish a thought he'd started and it was bothering him, and that if I was open to it, he'd like to continue it somewhere that wasn't a party. I read it twice, then I set my phone face down on the counter and went to make dinner, which was a completely normal thing to do, and absolutely not a way of making myself wait before responding. I lasted 11 minutes. We met at a restaurant he chose, small, quiet, the kind of place that doesn't need to try hard because everything about it already works. I got there first, which was intentional. I wanted a minute to settle before he arrived, to be already seated and composed, rather than walking in and scanning the room. It helped, a little. He came in through the side entrance, and I watched him navigate the space with the kind of ease that told me he'd been here before, and that the staff knew him. There was no fuss, no overcompensating attention from anyone, just a natural acknowledgement that felt respectful rather than performative. He spotted me, and something in his expression shifted in a way I couldn't quite name. Not surprise, more like confirmation, like he'd wondered something and now had his answer. He sat across from me, and for a moment, neither of us said anything. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that 2 people share when they're both aware that something real is happening, and neither wants to be the first to make it smaller by talking too fast. "You waited 11 minutes, he said. I felt heat move up the back of my neck. "To respond to your message," he he added, with the same calm he seemed to carry everywhere. I know because I was watching the 3 dots appear and disappear for about 8 of them. I had not accounted for the fact that he would have seen that. I was making dinner, I said. Sure, he said. And then, mercifully, the server came. Dinner was good. Better than good, if I'm being honest with myself, which I'm trying to do more of lately. He picked up the conversation exactly where he'd said he'd left off. A thought about certainty, about how most people perform confidence rather than actually feel it, and how he'd started to say something about that at the party before we'd gotten interrupted by the weight of his last name. I told him I thought most people perform a lot of things. He asked me what I performed. It was a direct question, and it landed directly, and I took a sip of wine before answering. Contentment, I said, finally. I'm very good at seeming like I have exactly what I need. He was quiet for a moment. And do you? Some days. He nodded like that was an honest answer, and he appreciated it. I noticed, not for the first time, how still he was when he listened. Not passive, present. There's a difference. We stayed for 2 hours. At some point, our conversation drifted from abstract to specific. My job, his work, the gap between what either of us had imagined our lives looking like at this point and what they actually were. He was candid without being heavy about it. I liked that. I liked him, which I was trying to hold carefully, like something that could tip if I moved too fast. Outside afterward, the air was cool, and we stayed in it longer than necessary. He was parked close, a dark SUV with adaptive controls. And when he opened the driver's door, I felt a strange impulse to delay the goodbye. He looked at me before getting in. Same time next week? He asked. I said yes before I finished thinking about it. And on the drive home, I replayed the exact way he'd looked at me when I walked in, like confirmation of something. And I couldn't stop wondering what question I had answered. The next week came and went, and then the week after that, and at some point I stopped counting the dinners as separate events and started thinking of them as a single, ongoing conversation that we kept returning to. We had a rhythm. He would pick the place. He had strong opinions about restaurants, which I found both slightly unreasonable and oddly attractive. And I would get there first, and he would come in through whatever entrance worked best. And we would sit across from each other for 2 hours and talk like we were trying to finish something. It was easy in a way that made me cautious. Easy has burned me before. I knew enough about myself to know that I have a tendency to romanticize consistency, to mistake someone showing up reliably for something deeper than it might actually be. So I kept a part of myself back. Not obviously, just enough. Dana noticed anyway. She has an aggravating gift for reading the specific frequency of my evasiveness. You like him, she said one afternoon, with the tone of someone stating a fact rather than asking a question. I told her it was complicated. She told me that was what people say when something is actually very simple and they're scared of it. I didn't argue because she wasn't entirely wrong. The 5th time we met, he suggested a change. Instead of dinner, he wanted to drive out to this overlook about 40 minutes outside the city. Somewhere he used to go, he said, when he needed to think. I said yes, mostly because the way he said it felt like an offering rather than a plan. Something he didn't share easily. He picked me up this time. I'd seen the SUV before, but being inside it was different. His space, his controls, the quiet confidence with which he handled everything, without a single moment of self-consciousness. There was music playing low, something instrumental I didn't recognize, and the city thinned out around us as we drove, and the conversation came in the comfortable, unhurried way it always did with him. The overlook was exactly what he'd described. A wide pull-off at the top of a long curve, the city spread out below in lights, the sky open above it. We stayed in the car at first. The air outside was sharp, and talked with the windows cracked just enough to feel it. At some point, the conversation slowed, and we were just quiet together, looking out. And I was aware of how close we were in the front seats of that car. The center console between us, his hand resting near the gear shift. I was aware of his hands more than I wanted to admit, the way they moved when he talked, deliberate and unhurried, the way everything about him was. "What are you thinking?" he asked. It was the first time he'd asked me that directly. I turned to look at him. In the low light from the dashboard, his face was mostly shadow, and I felt something pull in my chest that I didn't entirely trust. "That I'm not as careful as I thought I was," I said. He looked at me for a long moment without responding, and then, slowly, he reached over and brushed the back of his hand against mine, just once, just briefly, before looking back out at the lights below. My heart did something embarrassing, and I said absolutely nothing. The drive back was quieter than the drive out. Not tense, just full. The kind of quiet that settles between two people when something has shifted and both of them know it, but neither is ready to name it out loud yet. He walked me to my building door. That's how I still think of it, even though I know that's not quite the right way to describe it. He came with me to the entrance, and we stopped there in the cold, under the light above the door, and neither of us moved to end it. "I had a good night," I said, which was true and also completely inadequate. "You say that like you're surprised," he said. "I'm cautious," I told him. "I know," he said. And the way he said it, like he'd already accounted for that, like it wasn't a problem, but a fact he'd simply absorbed, did something to me I wasn't prepared for. He looked at me for a moment in that way he has, steady and unhurried, and I felt the air between us change the way it had in the car. That specific pull that I'd been carefully not acting on for weeks. And then he said, quietly, almost to himself as much as to me, "I'm trying to be patient with this." I didn't ask what he meant. I knew what he meant. "So am I," I said. He held my gaze for another second, then nodded once, like we'd agreed on something. I went inside. I got into the elevator and stood there while the doors closed and thought about the way he'd said it, not as a complaint, not as pressure, as an admission. From a man who I was quickly learning did not admit things easily. My phone buzzed before I reached my floor. A message from Stefan. 4 words. Same time next week? And then, before I could respond, a second message came through. One that didn't sound like him at all. One that made me stop breathing for a second in the middle of that elevator. This was part 1 of Stefan and Jennifer's story. And if you felt something tonight, I need you to tell me in the comments what you'd rate it, 1 to 10. Your feedback is what makes the next part happen. Thank you for being here. Part 2 is coming, and trust me, you don't want to miss it.